as well as Selena, and we will have. We're going to do. This is kind of an experiment in a way to have multiple presenters, kind of a thank you presentation, which I think it might be really fun to do, because I think it'll have. It's a nice way to introduce more people into the process, and perhaps it's more logical for a lab to have a few people to present and get your chance. Yeah, Selena.
We're actually going to have
four people. Oh, you're going to have four?
Yeah, Selena Gervais is here from Wyoming. She decided she's going to help out too. And
all right, good.
From the state.
Yeah, so yeah, good. Okay, well,
it's going to be a full rough cut.
And he's going to introduce each of you as we go along, so that it's not all done here. So first of all, though, Paul is an associate professor in the Land Resources and Environmental Sciences Department. His interests are in atmospheric exchange and with surface conditions, water, energy, and trace gases. He emphasizes plot scale measurements and regional and global scale synthesis from those measurements. Really focused on impacts of land use change and climate change on the surface energy balance, the carbon cycle, and hydrology effects. So, and he's going to talk today about updating us on track 2, and the title is obviously more involved than that, and I'll let you get into what parts of that you want to distribute here. So.
Yeah, Bruce, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the other people who will be presenting in advance, Selena Ahmed and Selena Gervais, as well as Hannah Goman. Track 2 proposal, so it's an NSF-EPSCoR project that we've been working on already for a year. We've already started year 2. Ben Poulter was the original PI. He's at NASA. I was a co-PI, so I moved to PI, and now Selena Ahmed is the Montana State co-PI with a number of senior investigators here, and co-PI is at South Dakota, University of South Dakota, and University of Wyoming. So briefly by the numbers, just an update for everybody. Okay, so far we have 49 participants in the project across all institutions. That includes 22 undergraduate and graduate scholars, 2 postdocs. We have so far 30 products, publications, presentations, websites, other things of that nature, which we're hoping to increase even more so now here in year 2. Notably, we have an overview paper in bioscience that received extremely favorable reviews, and it should be out as soon as we can manage to find the time to submit revisions that are due in less than a week, but that's pretty minor. The main institutions are Montana State, South Dakota, University of South Dakota, and Wyoming, but there critically are many other stakeholders and institutional partners that we are and or hope to reach out to provide critical information for our scenario building of what the upper Missouri River is going to look like in the near to far future. So the challenge is globally, this economic notion of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the idea that we blow things and put them underground to displace fossil fuels, is going to be necessary if we're hoping to avoid a planetary warming. How to do that. A lot of the integrated assessment models and global models of the climate system kind of assume that we're going to create an economic system that's based in part on actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere and also making our emissions from land use negligible. A pretty large challenge. The problem from this global perspective is, what does that actually mean to people on the ground? So individuals, jurisdictions, regions, and how this notion that we're going to be growing crops to create biofuels, to fuel power plants, and then pumping that carbon underground, all at the same time having less fossil fuel CO2 sources, that, as you can imagine, as we'll talk about more, will probably conflict with other aspects of not only food, energy, and water systems, which is sort of the hot topic now, but also other earth system services and other cultural values like biodiversity or social systems that we value, that we don't want trod over simply to make the land surface and our economy look like it's. So, a major question for our grant, and this is a figure from the overview paper created by Megan Jarchow and her team at South Dakota, is can we create a system that is maybe not perhaps full bioenergy carbon capture and storage based, right, but rather a system that is more cognizant of carbon science, that can be less carbon wasteful, while also conserving or even enhancing some other aspects of our region that we value: food, water, energy, systems, many of these attributes that we all hold dear, or we hold many dear. So, can we move from the business as usual scenario, which for the last slide is, as you know, in the Upper Missouri, kind of focused on food and feed, and perhaps even improve water quality while enhancing geologic carbon sequestration? So, are there opportunities with BECCS to do other things even better? Or by introducing a BECCS-based economy, are we going to compromise other parts of what we've been calling the FWEBs, the food, energy, water, biodiversity, and social science nexus? So with this project, and this is a mess of a slide, we're trying to understand much of this system. Intentionally not all of it, because there's enough folks perhaps studying food and feed, where we are looking not only at biological carbon sequestration, but also geologic carbon sequestration, and also cognizant of how those potential shifts in land management impact biodiversity and also biogeochemistry and water quality. What are the policy implications? Right? Things like Julia and her team are studying when we're moving from more coal, oil, and gas to perhaps more biofuels. And then what are the implications on this individual scale or the farm scale? And colleagues at Wyoming are working on those. Also, food security, cultural ecosystem services, other things that are really important to how we vision systems and how we value systems. Right? Selena and Megan Jarchow are studying those. And many students and many collaborators throughout trying to do our best to understand an extremely dynamic system. So we're going to start, actually, instead of tackling broader impacts on the end, as is oftentimes done, have Selena Gervais come and just give a brief overview of a few of the broader impacts that we've been engaged in so far.
Hi, I'm Selena Gervais, and I'm the Extension Outreach Coordinator for the WAFERx team. I'm pretty new in this position. And so when we're talking about broader impacts, obviously implementing BECCS or any sort of adaptive strategy like this would have a wide impact on a lot of different stakeholder groups. And so we're interested in exploring what those impacts will be and really getting a lot of community involvement early on and throughout the process. So we're starting doing that with, we're organizing a stakeholder workshop that we're going to have up here next month, where we're inviting people from agriculture, from energy, conservation, tribal representatives, water, people that are involved in all of these different systems that we're interested in the impact that this could have on them. And the purpose of this involvement is twofold. We not only want to involve them in the process and inform them about this, but we also want their feedback. We want them to help inform our research, to better our research and make sure that we're moving in directions that are going to be both economically feasible as well as socially feasible. So in our workshop, we're going to be both explaining our research to them and where we're headed, as well as getting their feedback so that we can improve our research throughout the process. And then this will be an iterative approach. We'll be doing this in South Dakota as well as in Wyoming, and then we'll be doing more throughout the years as we go to involve them throughout.
Yeah, so the notion is to integrate the broader impacts with the research. And right, one of the ways of doing so is to study the social systems, which Selena Ahmed.
Good afternoon. Carrying off from Paul and Selena Gervais, I'm going to sort of give you an overview of the project from a social science perspective. So when we're looking at VEC, that's very much being promoted in global climate change policy, such as the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, and however, how would the implementation of such a policy actually look at the landscape level, both for ecological systems as well as for social systems. And that's really what our project is getting at, to see how feasible is this and what are potential implications for social systems and ecological systems. So our overall statement of the problem is, how would VEX play out regionally in the Upper Missouri River Basin? And then from a social science perspective, what are actually barriers and incentives for the adoption of VEX? And are there other climate mitigation strategies that could be more receptive or effective in the specific region? And when we're thinking about energy, more and more we're recognizing the need not to only look at energy systems as coupled natural and human systems, but also how those coupled energy systems are interacting with our food systems and water systems. And so as a faculty member who focuses on food systems, it's becoming more and more important to me not only to train our students and carry out research on the sustainability of a food system, but also how that system is interacting with energy systems and water systems. And so this is a really exciting direction personally for my research and my courses, but I also think for research more broadly at MSU as well as nationally. I was at the NSF Infuse meeting in March, which is Innovations in Food, Water, and Energy Systems. And in addition to agency members from NSF, there were also agency members from the USDA and the Department of Energy. And they were saying that this is really going to become a future emphasis for funding in terms of their priorities. And so just something that I'm really excited about, to sort of see how these systems that we've been mostly studying independently are coming together. And from my perspective, looking at the literature, I think it's really interesting to look at the food, energy, water, biodiversity, and social science nexus, really thinking about the role of humans in all of this. And this includes our value systems, food security, farmer livelihoods, as well as our overall social capital. And I'm just going to provide a bit of a snapshot of some of the activities that my students have been carrying out in the Food and Health Lab, contributing to the overall Track 2 project. And so my role in the project is really to look at agricultural feasibility and the food security aspects of the trade-offs of food, water, energy, biodiversity, and social systems with various climate mitigation strategies. And that is a picture of my recent undergraduate and graduate students working in the lab this semester. So food security is variously defined, and we're looking at food security at 3 different levels in terms of food availability, both in terms of quantity, but also the quality of that food, food accessibility, as well as affordability, and looking at affordability both in terms of prices, as well as the stability of those prices. Food security is also looked at in terms of different scales. So there's the household scale, and this is really thinking about how individuals have access to specific food. It can be looked at more at the household level, within a community, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And for the sake of this research, we're looking at food security at a household level, a community level, a regional level, also within the state, as a lot of data is at the state level, and then nationally. And so Montana contributes, we're looking at how Montana overall contributes to food security in terms of its production, in terms of meeting the dietary guidelines of Americans in terms of foods, and then also how that may shift with various climate mitigation strategies. Also how other changes in the food environment, such as changes in biodiversity, may impact the household food environment, and what are the implications of that for food choices and ultimately health outcomes. So the first sort of the project, we're very much looking at the natural food environment. And so in the food environment literature, the food environments are sort of classified as either built food environments or natural food environments. And the natural food environments constitute the wild and cultivated food environments. And there's actually very little research in the food environment research on this part of the food environment. More so has focused on the retail food environment. So it's been very nice in this project to really have the opportunity to do some methodological development in the first year of really having some developing surveys and research frameworks of looking at the natural food environment from a food security perspective at the household and community level. And I'm just going to provide a little bit of a snapshot of some of the activities that we're carrying out on food security and land use valuation. One of my students is leading surveys looking at the role of wild biodiversity for food security and, more importantly, perhaps for cultural identity. So a lot of people will say that wild foods contribute a very small percentage of the actual amount of overall foods that we're consuming. However, they're extremely important in terms of how communities perceive these and how they contribute to their overall cultural identity. And so we're carrying out surveys to look at perceptions of climate change and other land use changes, how they're impacting wild foods, including the changes in distribution of these foods, the quality of these foods, access to these foods, and knowledge of these foods. And so we've started this research on the Flathead Reservation. This is actually in the Columbia River Basin and not in the Upper Missouri River Basin. However, I have long-term relationships working over there, and our goal is to test out the methods and then expand them in other tribal communities, not only in Montana, but in the Upper Missouri River Basin. We're also administering that as an interview, but also as surveys more broadly within the state. And so working with Extension to administer those to households throughout the entire state. The second part that we are working on is looking at how, which I mentioned a bit earlier, is how regional food supply contributes to food security, and specifically to the foods that are recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans, and how this would change under various climate change scenarios, climate mitigation scenarios, such as BECS. And then the third part is, what are alternatives that may be more socially acceptable or have more positive influence on food security in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation? So my students have been doing a literature review on this, as well as carrying out some initial focus groups looking at barriers and incentives to actually implementing some of the different climate mitigation and adaptation strategies with various agricultural stakeholders. And some of those we have identified that already exist in policy. And so these are some climate mitigation strategies that we identified that exist in dietary guidelines around the entire world. We did a literature review coding different sustainability dimensions, as well as climate mitigation and adaptation strategies that are actually at the consumer level. So how that are actually being recommended for consumers that ultimately would have an impact on climate. And so using this framework, we are now devising scenarios and questions for consumers as well as producers on their willingness to adopt some of these practices. And so this is work that's happening now in year 2 of the project. And this is with that methodological development, this is a paper that we submitted for peer review looking at the prevalence of different climate mitigation strategies that already exist in dietary guidelines around the world. So this is at the policy level. And now we're going to actually see people's willingness in this region to adopt some of those strategies. And then I'm going to pass it on to Hannah. But I just wanted to say that the social science component of this project, we very much hope to integrate and interact with the other parts of this project. For example, Carrie Miller is leading trials on potential biofuel crops. And in the future, once we have a better understanding of that, it would be really interesting to see what are producer barriers and incentives to implementing those strategies.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Goman. I'm a first-year PhD student working primarily with Dr. Payton in the CBE and also with Paul, and I'm looking forward to working with Perry Miller and Jack Brookshire on some of the agricultural part of this project. So, and I am in the microbiology department. Okay, there we go. So as we're looking at climate solutions in the upper Missouri River Basin here, and trade-offs between the water, energy, food, and agriculture, fertilizer is one of the, or is the most significant output of greenhouse gases in agriculture. So increasing feasibility of biofertilizers, specifically looking at cyanobacterial biofertilizers, is where my part comes in, and more specifically looking at changes in the microbial community as a result of implementing these biofertilizers. And my kind of general plan is looking at greenhouse studies as well as some field plots that we have out at the post farm to do that. So just so we are all on the same page of what we're working with, I don't know how much everyone knows about cyanobacteria. So the organism that we'll be working with is Anabaena cylindrica, which is a diazotrophic cyanobacteria, meaning that it can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. As you can see in this figure here, it can fix atmospheric nitrogen to plant usable ammonia. And it's also a photoautotrophic organism, meaning that it carries out photosynthesis, and so there's a little bit of a carbon capture bit there. And it's also a filamentous strain of cyanobacteria, so it has been shown to have some soil structure benefits as well. And just so, sorry, I should have done this first, but just as an idea of the difference between cyanobacteria, which was previously known as blue-green algae, and green algae, as you can see here in this little phylogenetic tree, we are more closely related to green algae than green algae are to cyanobacteria way over in that domain. So, and along with the filamentous part is that they're gram-negative cyanobacteria, so they produce the sticky exopolysaccharides, which also improve soil aggregation and structure there. And this strain is also non-cyanotoxic, so I'm sure you've all heard of the big algae blooms that kill dogs that go swimming in them and whatnot. So this one is not cyanotoxic and is considered a safe biofertilizer. So the importance of the soil microbial community that looking at it is that it's not yet well understood. It's a very dynamic ecosystem, so we need to be thinking about it in a system ecology kind of way, so that we are looking at the effects on the native species, because we are introducing a new species into that ecosystem, so we need to know how that's affecting it, and as well as there's been plenty of studies showing that there are benefits in the nutrient cycling and bioavailability as a result of biofertilizers. And there's also that little bit of carbon capture component to it, as well as the improved soil structure, which I don't think we're actually going to be looking at ourselves, but it's been fairly well documented already. And the way I like to think about it is, we've been thinking a lot more just in general about our own gut microbiomes in recently, as far as having the importance of having that balanced ecosystem in ourselves of the different species of bacteria. And the same thing applies to the soil, is that it's so important to have that balanced ecosystem, and we don't want to accidentally wipe everything out that's important and really screw ourselves up. But for the most part, biofertilizers haven't obviously been shown to have negative effects on the soil ecosystem, mostly only positive things, but we do want to know how we're affecting it. So far, so I just started here in June. We ordered a sample of Anabaena, and it came in a 1 milliliter slant on a little gel, so it's been a lot of growing that up. We have our 50 liter bag reactor growing out in the faculty courts. It's a lot thicker now. This was right in the beginning, as well as some carboys, and we have a few 200 liter raceways that are in the plant growth center, so I'll be looking at growing in those as well. And our friends in the LRES department are looking at developing more raceways so that we can grow even more biomass. And I've also been doing some water analysis out at a post farm because we're hoping to be able to grow our cyanobacteria on site so that we mitigate the transportation of it to be able to apply it as a biofertilizer, and also doing some initial soil DNA extractions to make sure that that's all going to work out, and working on designing a greenhouse experiment to do some initial tests on the biofertilizer effects as well. So some challenges that I've faced already so far are the post-farm water, the irrigation canal going through there is not proving to be particularly amenable to growing this strain of cyanobacteria. I think it's a combination of both nutrient limitation and potentially some predatorial protozoa or something is chewing on it. As you can see here, comparing optimal BG11 media with all of the nutrients it likes, nice and thick there. And then this is grown straight on normal post-farm water. This is after about 2 weeks. And then here I had added a little bit of phosphate, the phosphate that is normally added into the media, and then also added the full suite of nutrients that we add to normal media as well. And after another few days, both of those two cultures as well had gone yellow and died. So we're doing more analysis on there, and also going to be testing the well water instead of the irrigation water. It's a freshwater algae, so it doesn't really make sense that it's not growing on it. And it comes straight from the gallatin, so it's not treated with anything, but we're hoping to get down to the solution of that issue. And another thing that we're looking at is just being able to produce enough biomass to meet the nitrogen needs for we'll be growing Brassica carinata on the fields. So the addition of more raceways will hopefully help that. And talking to Perry, I believe regardless of how much we end up producing, we can always get to our nitrogen needs with adding normal chemical fertilizer as well. And just the inherent challenges of soil experimentation. It's such a dynamic ecosystem with variation. There's a lot of variation, from little spot to spot, and also just being able to, from literature that I've been reading, just the DNA extractions and sequencing and whatnot can be fairly difficult. But so we'll get that, we'll hurdle that as we go. And then for me, just getting started, just getting on riding the learning curve, reading till my eyeballs fall out, that kind of thing. But I'm really, really excited to be a part of this project. We just had a meeting on Monday with the full group of people, well, almost a full group of people here at MSU, and it was so cool to be in such an interdisciplinary group of really thoughtful, dedicated people. So, and I come from an agricultural background, so it's been really exciting to just be able to call up my dad and be like, hey, what do you think about this and whatnot. So, so that's been really exciting, and I'm really excited to see where that all goes. I had one more about some expectations. So the biofertilizers are fairly well documented to result in comparable growth fertilization as a two-chemical fertilizer. The main issues in actually implementing them on a large scale have been, well, primarily with more bacterial ones, it's having pure cultures and being able to grow enough and whatnot. And also we'll be able to have a greater understanding of soil ecosystems, and then the suite of improving microbial biomass and enzyme activity. Sorry, Paul. Nutrient cycling and soil structure all go for improvements in soil health. So that's it for me, and Paul's going to talk some more.
Yeah, thanks to Selena and Hannah for talking about part of the things that we're working on. We can't really do justice to everything that's going on, but we wanted to give a little bit of a flavor of a number of things that are happening. And one of the things that's happening is to use this experiment at the post farm and to use the knowledge that we gain to actually improve global models of things like the nitrogen cycle. So there's a postdoc, Do-Hyun Kim, who's working closely with Ben Poulter on integrating a nitrogen module into his dynamic global vegetation model, LPGIS, in order to have a better understanding of the entire nitrogen cycle under different scenarios, past, present, and future, to be able to essentially manage our large watersheds more effectively and with more cognizance of the impacts of things like nitrogen. That nitrous oxide on the climate system. So we probably didn't define this at first, and maybe we should have. The upper Missouri, as we're defining it, is everything north of Sioux City, Iowa, down here. And this is going to include the Big Sioux over here, which oftentimes might not be included otherwise in the upper Missouri, but that's where our colleagues way down here in Vermilion, South Dakota have much of their field research sites. Laramie is actually outside the upper Missouri, but it mostly comprises almost all of South Dakota, most of North Dakota, some of Wyoming, most of Montana. And we don't necessarily take an extremely strict watershed view all the time, but this is the area hydrologically that we're focusing on. So something that my group's been active in and we're really curious about, and I'll just be another 10 or 15 minutes or so, and we're hoping to have a good amount of time for questions for everybody, is we have this notion of ecosystem services, or I think that ecosystems are doing for us for free, that we want to preserve or enhance to better society and societal objectives. But can we also think of earth system services, like how can land management perhaps be thought of as a climate service? And this region that we're working on, right, is extremely unique for recent climate trends. Not only this year, which I'm happy to talk about at length after this main part of the presentation, there's been a massive, severe drought in northeastern Montana, western North Dakota, parts of South Dakota earlier on. That drought's kind of crept west and has caused a lot of fires now. Until hopefully tomorrow, there's a huge cold front coming through, which we're all holding my breath for. I can't wait for some cold, rainy weather. So I'm happy to discuss what's happened in 2017 and what we hope to learn about what's happened. But until this year, at least, or perhaps even including this year, this is one region of the world that's actually been either cooling or not warming over the past 40 or so years, which is kind of remarkable if globally temperatures have increased by, per decade, right, almost half a degree per decade globally. So this is way, way far on the edge of what the global trends have been in summer temperatures. And no matter how you slice and dice, if this is a different map, you still see this area of parts of the upper Missouri, perhaps Iowa, perhaps Minnesota, depending on exactly what you're looking at, is actually cooling in the summertime, whereas it's been the part of the conterminous United States, CONUS, that's been warmest, it's gotten the warmest in the wintertime over the same time frame. So where I'm from, you know, we grow up, you flood your backyard and you play hockey, and you don't do that anymore. Things are much warmer now than they were. And in the summertime, they're either actually statistically cooler, or there isn't a change, and that's really unique. And we want to understand the mechanisms and if land use and land management is actually contributing to that mechanism. So because this is funded by NSF, and we can take a relatively broad view of science, we can ask radical questions like, is there a big country to our north that we probably shouldn't be excluding when trying to understand how agricultural systems, climate systems in our region work? So what I'm going to be arguing here is that perhaps a lot of what we're seeing with respect to regional climate trends of key importance to agriculture are just part of a larger North American cooling system, the mechanisms of which have actually been studied, of course, by the Canadians. So and they've done a pretty good job of that too. So I'll be talking about some data that we've collected in lab, former graduate students in the Judith Basin, as well as Glasgow International Airport, GDW, in northeastern Montana, as well as Fort Peck. In the reservation, there's been a long-running ecovariance system that has been absolutely critical for our understanding of how these native grasslands work, carbon cycle and water cycle. So everybody always focuses right away on temperature, but there's other things that are really important for crop growth, that are really important for climate, like atmospheric humidity and the vapor pressure deficit. The North American Great Plains are much more humid in the summer, either May, June, July, like we're studying here, or the climatological summer, June, July, August, as is typically understood. And you see two large patches here. This is a figure that my graduate student Gabe Bromley made. One that looks suspiciously a lot like the Oglala Reservoir down here, and one that seems to be focused here in Saskatchewan that might have a little bit of a peninsula heading down into the Dakotas. So there's, you know, you can, visually, it looks like there's sort of two major regions of atmospheric moistening that we need to understand better. And in these areas, there's actually in Saskatchewan and in the Dakotas, there's been a lot of early season flooding going on lately. In Glasgow, Montana, and northeastern Montana, there are three times more rain now than there was in the 1990s. And there's actually a jump earlier than that in June. So especially earlier on in the season, right, there's been a lot more moisture. We want to understand if that's coming from elsewhere or if that's being recycled internally and is actually an interesting regional feature of how the surface interacts with the atmosphere to form a feedback. So more evaporation from the land surface might actually cause more clouds and precipitation. So what are some of the leading hypotheses of why this, in the northern Great Plains, that would be perhaps the Dakotas and perhaps over Montana as well as Canada, what's been happening, a slide I've shown before for people who've heard this talk from me before, is that in the past, and still in some areas in the present, there's been a lot of summer fallow, a lot of leaving land bare to conserve water in deeper soil layers for subsequent growing periods. But at the time, you just have a nearly bare field that's contributing a lot of heat, but not much water to the atmosphere. This doesn't just impact what's happening at the surface, it impacts the cloud base height, which we call the atmospheric boundary layer height. Because warm air rises, right, that warm air can rise quite high before it condenses, and that level at which it does, we're going to call the lifted condensation level. So we have a pretty large change in not just what's happening for surface temperatures when you're moving from a system that's mostly bare soil to mostly green, or not mostly, but a lot of bare soil. I'll show you the next slide. That might be important enough to impact regional climate in a meaningful way. So critically, from the Beck's perspective, you're only losing carbon from the soil if you're not planting anything. You might not be gaining a lot of carbon by, for example, wheat agriculture, but you're certainly losing less carbon than if you're just leaving fields bare across the summer for heterotrophic respiration to take place, and right, likely serve to the detriment of soil fertility. So how much fallow did there used to be across the United States and Canada total? There used to be about that much fallow. So Arizona-sized patch of bare dirt, mostly in the Great Plains. In the US, both the southern Great Plains as well as the northern Great Plains, almost entirely the Canadian breadbasket, so Saskatchewan especially. Now there's only something about the size of this in terms of how much fallow remains, and that's mostly, and I have some slides about that, in the Golden Triangle of Montana, that's that area north of Great Falls, as well as in western Kansas and eastern Colorado. These dry land, wheat fallow crop rotation areas where fallow is still actively used as a management practice. I gave this talk recently at ESA in Portland. The difference between these two states is about the size of Oregon. So an Oregon-sized patch of ground used to be kept bare in the summertime, and now it's planted. This is going to meaningfully impact regional climate. This is something that's big enough. So we know from measurements and just from logic that something like summer fallow is not going to be compatible with a bioenergy with carbon capture storage strategy because you're losing carbon from that bare ground in the summertime. These are eddy covariance measurements that my grad student Liza Vick made a few years ago. In the Judith Basin, you have losses of carbon. That's that positive number, means carbon is going to the atmosphere. And then your wheat crop on an annual basis might not be sequestering a lot of carbon per se, but during the growing season, it is sequestering carbon, at least over those timescales. So we also can measure, right, evapotranspiration, how much water is entering the atmosphere, and actually how much heat is entering the atmosphere. So those are thermals that you can see like over a hot parking lot. You see all that refraction. You can measure those eddies that are carrying heat up to the atmosphere and find, as you might imagine, that a fallow field looks a lot like a parking lot, and that's delivering a lot of heat to the atmosphere. And the evapotranspiring far less because there's no plants there actively transporting water from the rooting zone through the plant to the atmosphere. So we have these large differences in surface energy partitioning that are subsequently involving atmospheric boundary layer behavior in this way. When you have water and heat, right, both of which are buoyant, especially heat, those particles of air rise until they condense. Right? So if they rise to the top of the atmospheric boundary layer, and it has crossed this thing called the lifted condensation level, then you can have a convective cloud form. Right? If those two levels don't cross, you don't get a convective process. So we're studying these crossings, not as a way to formally resolve clouds, which is extremely complicated, but rather as a way to say, can convective rain occur? And then we can study over the past many decades using reanalysis climate data, using eddy covariance measurements, using just climate station data, how frequently those crossings have occurred, right? And if there's been meaningful changes in these processes over, for example, parts of Montana. So this is a really brief overview of a paper that my postdoc Tobias Gherkin with Gabriel Bromley and myself submitted to the Journal of Hydrometeorology that we hope to send the revisions in soon. But we've moved from a system, the Bowen ratio is the ratio between the sensible heat flux and the latent heat flux, from a system where the Bowen ratio is about 2, so twice the amount of heat entering the atmosphere, than there was moisture, to a system where those are now in balance. And from our slab atmospheric model simulations, we're finding about a 10% increase in the likelihood of convective process. Might not sound like a lot, but oftentimes in these dryland systems, every rain event really counts. One rain event could actually be the difference between failure and success. The problem is this last year that didn't really, right, everything was regionally quite different. Things were extremely dry, so there was something more synoptic, something larger scale going on. But, right, likely due to these land cover changes, we have a situation where it's raining more, at least in northeastern Montana. So we're trying to understand also how land management and in the future with potentially different scenarios that include biofuels might likewise influence precipitation processes and climate. So moving forward, right, we're trying to understand if there is a win-win-win scenario that's emerging amongst soil conservation, regional climate, farm scale economics in the upper Missouri, or perhaps it isn't. And then expanding this beyond this sort of farm cloud system, as we're radically changing, and you see it from the previous slides how quickly that's happening, right? How rapidly an Arizona-sized area of fallow was switched to planting something. Oftentimes, the alternate cropping strategies that Perry and many other people have been encouraging Montana producers, oftentimes with very much success to grow. So as we're radically changing a system like the Upper Missouri River Basin, how does it influence not only a couple of human climate processes, but other couple of human system processes? And that's where I wanted to end it with a few minutes for questions, because this is a little bit of an overview of a large project. For those who came in late, we've really gotten underway with 49 people across the 3 institutions, a lot of products, a lot of papers out, a lot of papers to be submitted soon. And I also wanted to mention we're taking, somewhat intentionally, try to have an extremely transparent decision-making process within the project team. Everything is on Dropbox for everybody to be able to explore. All of our meeting notes are online if people actually want access. I'm more than happy to give those to you, so that everybody knows what all these different organizations are doing in order to help try to make this extremely complicated project with many senior investigators, many students, many stakeholders, as integrative and interactive and ultimately hopefully as fun as possible. So with about 15 minutes left, I'm extremely happy to take questions, and please also for Selena A, Selena G, and Hannah, any questions. Thank you.
This is maybe on the boundary of what you're doing in terms of thinking of the EPSCoR system. The EPSCoR system I find really intriguing, but I think back to some of the lessons from the push for ethanol. And kind of a simple story there was that we said, all right, we have all these policies in place to encourage ethanol use. That drove up demand for corn, which caused farmers to put more of their land into corn, which drove out soybean from the farm belt, which indirectly caused a increase in soy production in Brazil, which was associated with cutting out rainforests, which kind of undid any possible benefit that you may have out of ethanol in the first place. Here we're talking more small grains, I'm guessing. Have you thought about, if we switch to a bioenergy crop, where is that small grain production going to go, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, that's a key question, and something that we're attacking from multiple angles. So we have to study something, close our system somehow. And like, as you say, right, when there's additional incentive, some might perhaps correctly argue a perverse incentive to make even more corn. One part of the world where it's like, how can you possibly grow more corn? That's all there is. You're creating situations that external to the system is causing tortilla riots in Mexico, and is causing more soy to cut down more rainforest in Brazil, absolutely. So this gets into a couple ethical questions, right? In Montana, we grow mostly food that people eat. Wheat, lentil, right? All these things that by displacing those and creating a biofuel instead, there might be kind of an ethical quandary that we were actually contributing very positively to the global food system. And these areas, right, wheat in Montana, corn in Iowa, these are regions that are large enough and areas of production that are large enough to actually make a global impact. So the question then becomes, right, where is VEX happening? And we had this discussion amongst our team meeting on Monday, because we probably can't actually grow something and put it right into a power plant here and put that carbon right into the ground here. Because what those power plants require is lots of low quality biomass that grows rapidly, of the sort that we here in Montana don't produce. Our low quality biomass doesn't grow very quickly, just the trees in the mountains. And the biomass that we do produce is high quality, right? High nitrogen wheat, for example, high protein wheat. Right, other places that can grow what have you, miscanthus or corn stover or coppice willow, right? Those might be the locations in the world where you can just take something that's growing next door and stick it right into a power plant, create power, pump that CO2 underground, and displace the fossil fuel that might have come from it. What Brassica carinata does is it can even perhaps be used as a jet fuel. People are investigating that. So it kind of becomes a high-level fuel that could perhaps displace some of the fossil fuels that are used in the transportation industry, but can't be used in a literal sort of BECCS going from point A to point B, right, in the power plant to point C, very deep underground. So we also have to take a pretty open view of what BECCS means, and literally in Montana, all of BECCS itself isn't quite feasible in the sense of strictly perspective. Although we have to think about a region and this massive aridity gradient that we have, and the ongoing march of corn soylandia from eastern South Dakota into actually western North Dakota, Canada. Okay, the world is becoming even more corn soy, and all of the climate models are projecting that Montana is going to get even wetter, such that we can probably also grow corn soy here, maybe. Who's to say? So yeah, in other words, right, from the bioenergy with carbon capture storage perspective, it's interesting to think about a lot of these questions, although we're not able to answer all of them. But we have to consider all of them, or else we're going to find ourselves in the situation that we described, which probably wasn't the best thing for the Earth system. I would agree. Question by Julia.
Well, I would just, and I think Mary wants to follow up too. Yeah. It's a really interesting question, and one that's really vexing us, right? Like, can we really ever call this a closed system? So I think in any big project like this, half of what you do is generate interesting hypotheses. And one of the things that we'll see are maybe some trade-offs that force us to better understand the political economy of food trade out of Montana. And I would just say that the grain trade in Montana is by no means sort of social justice neutral. That comes with a whole complicated history. So, in year 3, let's write a proposal together now. Let's learn stuff, what's and values.
I think it's important to keep in mind too that there's still 3 million hectares of fallow. If you look at a company like Agrosoma that's invested very heavily in production internationally, they're right on their webpage. One of the first bullets they say, "We're some fallow." So they're trying to dot this argument. I'm sure it's also oversimplification, but they're obviously aware of it. Trying to target land that's currently not producing, then by getting it to production, and actually help it. In the East, involved some of this research there on biofuels, and the agronomists all say, "Oh, we've got all this really kind of low quality land, so we're going to grow miscanthus or some willows or something like that. We just have to create the markets, and the farmers will take all this land." And the argument I keep getting is, how do you know that's where they're going to go? They're not going to take the best land. Once we create this high value crop that they can get money for, why not put your best land into it? It's an empirical question. Yeah.
Yeah, but the way that we can try to do our best to find out is through the stakeholder workshops that Selena G is organizing right now, to talk to industry, to talk to stakeholders, to talk to people from agricultural organizations, NGOs, policymakers, university people, to say, hey, what will the land surface look like over the next decades? The next decades of which we're going to have to actually radically decrease the amount of carbon that we're pumping in the atmosphere. So it becomes part thought experiment and part reality. And it's, there's no way of knowing which is which, but it's something that we need to attack pretty vigorously is our argument. More points? Bruce.
So I've got a fairly specific question about your evapotranspiration case. I'm fascinated by the fact that the evapotranspiration in Fallow is not level.
Yeah.
Quite low, maybe with spikes in it.
So this is a cumulative sum, which does tend to smooth out some of the after rain event. There's going to be spiked. There just aren't many rain events in summer. Couple, at least this summer in the Judith Basin. So yeah, so if you look at the time series, it would look a little bit different. This is just adding up how much water actually went to the atmosphere, and that does have a natural smoothing effect. And it is surprising that there was actually that much evaporation. This is all well, it's not entirely evaporation because there's always some weeds growing. And oftentimes farmers use chem fallow where they're actually, putting basically just pesticides onto their own fields, which also burns carbon in the course of doing so. So yeah, so when you're looking at things cumulatively, there's a smoothing that wouldn't look quite so smooth if you're looking at the literal time series of every half-hour measurement of evapotranspiration.
And any rain that does fall is going to be stuck in the dry top centimeter where it's very exposed to.
Yeah, it's you get these really hard packed soils where you have some rain falling and infiltration is lousy to negligible. So yeah, it's all evaporation. It's a little bit more than we thought, but this is a soil just progressively drying out throughout the entire year. So there's a water loss. Here, Ted.
Wall Street Journal just had an article, I think it was Saturday, about people making investing choices, and your investment advisor is going to advise you based on things you say you want and how you think you'll react to those. And the point of this article was that these things that are learned in such exchanges are often very wrong. So we think we can study things like that by talking to farmers and so on. How do we insulate ourselves from making bad correlations, if you like?
So for my argument would be to bring as many people to the table as possible so that people, Perry is always a good example, can say, farmers, you can't do that from the agronomic perspective. Or have someone from the industry perspective of the conversation for how a WAFERx type scenario might be unraveling, say, no, this is never going to happen for industry. So instead of literally knowing what is going to happen, because we can't predict the future, we can bound the problem by knowing what is simply not a possibility, yet still opening up that entire space for possibilities. So with respect to your analogy, it would be many people talking to that investment advisor and discussing a number of things that go and inform their choices for how that advisor is investing the money of a lot of people. So hopefully without being groupthink, which is another problem. So yeah, that would be, I guess, perhaps an analogy for how the stakeholder workshops might play out.
Excuse me.
Are you investing?
What do you want to say?
Yeah, Kathy.
The increased convection because of local climate.
Mm-hmm.
As I understand it, I think a lot of the TCMs also show increased convection, like more onshore flow, and greater intercontinental ground heat may bring more onshore flow and more convection into the Great Plains regions. I'm wondering how you sort of dynamic regional circulation stuff going on.
Historically, by front tracking, you can take a front tracking algorithm, apply it to a historical database, find out where weather systems have come from. You can always take isotopic approaches for all their benefits and disadvantages. What my new PhD student, Skylar Williams, is doing is looking at radar and trying to do historical frontal system analysis to find out where things are coming from. What you will see in the literature for extreme events locally is that when they run the simulations, they'd actually find out a lot of the moisture that's being precipitated locally. So a lot of what we're studying and a lot of what's important to farmers is extreme events, and that really hasn't been studied very much in our region today. It's absolutely critical for crops not have desiccating temperatures for a week or more, as we saw this year. That's central. And to manage for avoiding extremes, Skylar is also really interested in hail, so we're going to try to do some hail work. There's some other things that are happening. Basically, the world is becoming more convective, right? There's more energy at the surface. There's more energy available to rise up. So the entire world is becoming more convective. And that's changing both the synoptic processes as well as the local processes. What we don't know and what we'd like to figure out is how much of the moisture that we get during the summer is synoptic versus how much is local, because we actually have some control over the local processes. And that being said, a lot of what's happening in the spring in this argument, and this is really much more of a springtime thing, is not dissimilar from the what's called the drunken jet stream hypothesis, where you have a rapidly warming Arctic, so the gradient between tropical and Arctic temperatures is not nearly as steep, locking the jet stream not quite as cleanly into its traditional path. So it takes that form of what's called Rossby waves, with wild swings in the jet stream. And the argument is that in the Dakotas, in our region, in spring, we can actually get some Arctic blasts of air simply from that region. So that would be one example of, perhaps, in the drunken jet stream hypothesis has been argued, one way in which a global impact is influencing us. And then what we need to understand is how much global impact and change we've seen versus how much is local. Because producers tend to get pretty excited to know that, right, what people are doing across large landscapes is actually meaningfully impacting their weather. What we don't know, what we need to figure out is the degree to which that's happening. So, and this becomes hopefully leading to, like we said, like Selena said, right, more hypotheses about the system that we're studying. So we're focused pretty strongly, but not myopically, on convective precipitation, but there are also changes to synoptic weather patterns and changes to the general circulation that, as we know, are also being impacted by climate change. It's been on our minds, and like we were talking about before, the question is how to best bound the problem, how to best simplify, as we do with the old science cliche, to say we're studying this and not that, while not completely ignoring everything else that's happening. More questions? We have to wrap up. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone very much. I think that's all of the co-presenters.